Hey, welcome back to Totally Rad Guitars. In this video I'm going to be checking out the Marshall Vintage Modern, a really cool amp that came out in 2006 and has a couple of unique features of the circuit. I also have a Marshall Plexi just above it, so we can talk about that in comparison because they actually share a lot of similarities. This amp came out in 2006, just a year before the JVM, which is probably the most popular Marshall for several years now. The JVM has a lot of modes and 4 channels and a lot of different features that make it really usable for touring musicians and gigging musicians. And a lot of people would think you might be able to get the same kind of tones out of the JVM as you can out of the Vintage Modern. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Vintage Modern never really sell that well and is currently discontinued. The JVM has a couple of channels that are supposed to be Plexi-like or JTM45-like. Those are terms you see thrown around in marketing material all the time, not just for the JVM, but even for other boutique-made hand-wired amps and that sort of thing. The Vintage Modern was Marshall's kind of take on this. Basically, it's modeled after the JTM45/100, which is the 100-watt Marshall amp that came out in the mid-60s, I think 1966, and it uses 4 KT66 power tubes, and so does the Vintage Modern. On that amp you have 2 channels, much like a Plexi. I don't actually have a JTM45, for example, so this is a 1987 model, but the principles of the circuit design are still the same. Basically, you have 2 channels that are parallel. You have a normal channel and a high treble channel. When you jumper the inputs, like I have here on this Plexi, and in one of my previous videos I show that, you're plugging your guitar in and then your guitar signal is going through both channels simultaneously, like in parallel, as opposed to in series, like in one shot. So amps like the JMPs and JCM 800s and a lot of the famous Marshall sounds, they use what's called a cascading gain stage, which is basically multiple gain stages in series. The signal goes directly through. On the Plexi and the JTM45, when you're plugged into the high treble channel, it's just two gain stages, 1 and 2, and then out to the tone stack driver and phase inverter. And then the normal channel is the same thing, 1 and 2, and then tone stack driver and phase inverter. When you have the channels jumpered, you're getting multiple gain stages, but instead of all in a row, your signal's hitting them at the same time concurrently, and then that signal is being blended together and then sent to the output. On those amps, when you have the channels jumpered, you can adjust the mix between the 2 channel types by adjusting the high treble and the normal volume controls individually. On the Vintage Modern, instead, you have a detail and a body control. And one thing I think is really, really special about this amp compared to others, and this is kind of getting into the more technical side of things, and you could have all the technical things right in the world, and if it doesn't sound good, then it doesn't sound good. Some people will love this amp and some people won't. That's just how it is. But this amp is the only amp that I can think of, off the top of my head at least, that truly emulates the 2 channels in parallel setup. So if we look at the circuit diagram, the signal comes in to the V1 tube, V1A and V1B in parallel. So your signal is actually hitting both tubes. It's as if you're playing through a jumpered JTM or a jumpered Plexi, but the jumper is always there all the time. So your signal goes into both those tubes as separate gain stages in parallel. Then it goes on to the V3 tube, which is your last gain stage, and then the tone stack driver, and then to the output tubes, just like an authentic JTM or Plexi. Now, the V2 tube is only engaged when you're in high dynamic range mode. And one of the things you see a lot in the marketing material for this amp is that it's very dynamic and it plays according to your picking response and all sorts of stuff like that. And that's definitely true, but a lot of it is kind of marketing fluff. I mean, any single channel Marshall amp is dynamic. Even I have a TSL, which is not exactly known for being the most dynamic amp, and I can still control the amount of gain by using my volume knob on that amp just fine. So I think they really kind of played that up because this amp it's unique in a way that's hard to explain in sort of generic marketing material. And I think that's also what killed it on store shelves. If you go into a Guitar Center or something and you've got a vintage modern and it's side by side with a JVM, and you play the JVM and it's got, you know, all these channels and all these modes, you think, well, there's got to be the same tones in the JVM and the prices aren't too far off, so why wouldn't I just buy the JVM? And I think that's what a lot of people did. But this amp, it's not technically, I guess technically it is a 2-channel amp, because you've got you've got your normal channel and your, well, in this case it's called body. Your body channel is your normal channel and your detail channel is your high treble channel. So you've got body and detail, 2 channels, but they're being run in parallel, so you don't switch between them or anything like that. But you do have the dynamic range thing, which when you engage that second tube, because it's adding 2 gain stages to the signal path, it's a lot more gain. And I kind of think that this was sort of inspired by a lot of 80s era, 70s era modded Marshalls, where someone might have taken a Plexi or a JTM and basically just crammed a tube with a gain stage just right in the middle of it, which is basically what this is, for better or for worse. And it definitely has a lot of gain when it's in the high dynamic range mode, but I wouldn't exactly call it, I mean, vintage modern kind of implies that it can do like old school tones and then maybe modern like metal tones or something, and it does not. It's not really a metal amp. I mean, you definitely could play like 70s, 80s era metal on it, but it's not going to do modern metal without a boost, or at least not very well. And that's fine, because the amp was clearly not designed for that. And one thing about having those 2 channels in parallel and then combining them at the end, it can be a little difficult to dial in the right mixture. And that's something that plagues even Plexi and JTM owners, is finding the right balance when the channels are jumpered between normal, which might make the low end a lot flubbier, and the treble channel, which is usually very treble and can be a little bit, you know, shrieky or piercing. And that's actually why a lot of people that have Plexi amps and stuff, they'll modify one of the 2 channels by, you know, basically bringing them a little closer together in terms of frequency spectrum, so that when they adjust them, they can get a little bit more of a balanced tone. The vintage modern, because everything's fixed, obviously you could modify it, but everything is fixed in that way where you've got 2 separate channels at either end of the spectrum, and I'll kind of demonstrate that here. It also has a plate reverb, which is a digital reverb, but it actually sounds really, really, really good. And I'll use that a little bit in the video too. And it has a 2-button foot switch to switch between dynamic range and the reverb on and off. It has an effects loop, and one other feature it has is this mid-boost control. And the mid-boost actually, it's a little bit confusingly worded, but I think I understand why they named it that. But it's actually, when you have the mid-boost enabled, it's actually the core tone of the amp. When the mid-boost is off, it's actually engaged a notch filter, and that filter is attached just before the V2 tube on the body channel. So only the body channel is affected by the mid-boost. If I turn the body volume all the way off, so effectively that channel is not being used, I can flip the mid-boost on and off and it won't make any difference to the tone. The mid-boost is also not foot switchable, although I think it would be really cool if you could make that foot switchable. But one issue I think this amp has, and another reason maybe why it wasn't quite so popular and why they tried to really play up the whole dynamics using your guitar volume and that sort of thing, is that the volume difference between the high dynamic range and low dynamic range and mid-boost on and off is very far apart. And I think a lot of modified vintage moderns that I've seen, they have a like a volume control on the back, or maybe multiple volume controls on the back, because really, like, low dynamic range, mid-boost on and off needs separate volume controls, and high dynamic range, mid-boost on and off also needs separate volume controls. So you know, it's not really ideal for that kind of like touring style. The little blue LED is dead on mine. And it actually, this being the first year, in the first couple of years, it came in this really cool like purple Tolex, which I'll kind of show in some detail shots. And also the front panel is also Tolexed in, kind of like a plexi. It definitely, it's the standard modern head shell, but they kind of tried to make it, you know, a little bit unique. And there's also a speaker cabinet that comes with a Celestion sort of vintage speaker, the same speaker that came in the Jimi Hendrix cabs, which is I don't have here. So for this video, my speakers, I'm using a 1986 Marshall JCM 800 cab with G12 T75s. If you don't know, the old G12 T75 is very different from the current production one. It's a little bit closer to maybe the G12-65 Heritage series in tone. I have those two speakers and I played them side by side and they're pretty close. I have a more recent G12 T75 and it sounds way different than these, so just keep that in mind while you're listening. This is a vintage cab. I'm playing just straight through the amp. I don't have any pedals hooked up or anything like that, and there's no reason to really. And then for the guitar, I'm playing a 1984 Kramer Floyd Rose Signature, which is kind of this odd body shape, banana headstock neck and maple fretboard. The pickups are Schaller Golden 50s, which are really, really great sounding. Actually, they only measure about 8K, but they're actually pretty high output. I'm going to start out on the low dynamic range channel, and just in the bridge position, and I'll kind of flip around a couple of things. The reverb is currently engaged. So as you can hear, it's got a really, really nice clean tone. And if I engage the mid boost, you'll kind of hear the more Marshall character come through. When the mids are notched out like that, it's definitely a lot cleaner, and it just doesn't have that same kind of Marshall grit. But flipping on the mid boost kind of brings it back. So. So I think that sounds pretty good. And let me kind of show also, if I take the body control all the way off, and I'll turn the detail all the way back up here, and go down to the bridge pickup, so you can hear kind of the core tone with the detail maxed out. It's very bright. And if I flip on and off the mid boost, you'll hear there's not really any difference because the body control is turned basically to 0. Now, if I do the opposite, if I roll the volume control all the way up and take the detail all the way down, you'll hear a big difference. So right now, the mid boost is disengaged, and you can hear it's very bassy. But if I flip that mid boost back on, you'll hear sort of the frequencies come back through. I'm not sure exactly what the mid boost is centered on, but it definitely feels like it's in that like 2 to 3 kilohertz range, which is like where the attack of the strings is, because the very high treble is still there. So if I flip that on, so you can hear that. That's a pretty big difference. So, and of course you can blend these kind of however you want. I actually really like to just have them matching, but if I turn like the body down and the treble up, you can kind of get some in between tones. And then both of them maxed out, you can get a pretty authentic plexic crunch. I mean, or JTM crunch, I guess. I mean, the circuits are pretty similar. So I think that sounds pretty awesome. And if let me roll these back down just a little bit. I'll put them right at the halfway point, and I'll take the mid boost out, and we're going to switch to the high dynamic range mode, and you'll hear just how much difference there is in gain. Let me roll that, well, I'll just take the reverb completely off. So yeah, it's definitely a bit more gain. That actually it's a little bit raspier. You can hear that there's more gain stages involved, but it's not an outright huge increase in gain with the controls at half compared to when I had them both maxed on the other channel. or rather in low dynamic range mode. Now if I turn these both all the way up, kind of show the maximum amount of gain that you can get out of this. It's a lot brighter on this mode than the other, especially with the mid boost disengaged. Now if I put the mid boost on, then the normal channel is no longer missing that extra punch. So we'll put that on, and then this is pretty much as modern as it's going to sound. So ultimately, I think probably the best position is some sort of combination between the detail and body channels in either high dynamic or low dynamic range mode. And what the exact best combo is probably going to depend a lot on what speakers you have and what your musical style is. I mean, if you like that brighter, louder, punchier tone, then obviously you're going to enjoy the detail a little bit more. And I really think the mid boost is more or less critical to a lot of the tones of this amp. I think having the ability to take the mids out for the occasional clean tone or something like that is really cool, but it's not quite that like authentic Marshall sound that you normally think of. Now one other thing, I know I said I wasn't going to use any pedals, but I'm going to set both of these to right about 7 with the, and I'm going to leave the mid boost out. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to engage this. I have a Tubescreamer on the floor behind me, and I'm just going to turn it on, and I'm going to show what it sounds like boosted with and without the mid boost. This is kind of where you get into that like 80s metal territory, and maybe you could push it a little further with like maybe a more aggressive pedal than a Tubescreamer, something like a full tone OCD or something like that. But I'm just going to use a Tubescreamer. Alright, so this is with the high dynamic range. Mid boost is not enabled. Alright, so still with the Tubescreamer engaged, but this time with the mid boost on. Yeah, so it's definitely capable of doing that really high gain thing, but you gotta have you really have to have a boost pedal to make that happen. It's not quite there on its own, or at least it's not quite as optimal sounding as rolling the gains back a little bit and adding a boost. But that's pretty normal for modern Marshall amps. And overall, I think the idea behind this amp is really, really awesome. I mean, there's so many amps that say something like plexi channel or plexi-like tones or whatever, and they're really only emulating a plexi in the sense that they're limiting the amount of gain and they're trying to get the voicing kind of like whatever they think an optimal plexi sounds like. So instead of leaving it up to them or using an amp that only emulates one channel, for example, I have a Seriatone King Kong, and on that amp the clean channel is modeled after a 68 plexi. But it's just the high treble channel of that amp. It doesn't emulate the normal channel, so there's no blending or anything like that. On an amp like this, you can get really, really into the tweaking if you want to get those really authentic like JTM and plexi tones, and you retain control over how it's going to sound, plus the added benefit of the high dynamic range mode, adding that extra tube gain stage in there. And whether that'll be useful to you or not kind of depends. I think if you're like a really modern metal player, or you're really into that 80s rock metal tone stuff like I am, I don't think this is going to upset like a JCM 800 or even a JVM or something like that for you. But if you're more kind of on the like classic vintage side of things, or you really like 60s rock and you just want to push it like that one step further, this is a really, really great amp and really unique in the way that it's set up. And overall, I think well worth keeping in the catalog. It's a shame they're discontinued now, but they're quite cool. And I didn't show the plate reverb on the high dynamic range channel, so I'm gonna just switch to that real quick. The Tubescreamer is still off. But I just wanted to show how cool the reverb sounds, because it has that like and you can dial it back. I had it pretty high up there. Here it is, maybe at like 3, it's just barely on. That's pretty cool. All right, thanks for watching, and see you next time.